Hey, all you cool cats and kittens. It's Mr. V. We've got our 2008 Hyundai Azera 3.8 liter engine, and we're going to do some valve cover gaskets. Being a V6, this engine has two valve covers, one in the front and one in the rear of the engine underneath the intake manifold. The front cover is the easier of the two. There's a few brackets and electrical wires that have to come off before accessing the 19 bolts that hold it on. The rear cover is accessed by taking off the intake manifold. There's 6 bolts that hold it onto the engine and 2 more in the back for support. But before this comes off, there's a bunch of wires and brackets that have to come off. There are a number of wires and brackets and tubes, the intake hose, that all have to be removed and set out of the way so that you can take off the front cover and the intake manifold. And I've sped this up a little bit for everybody's sanity, but it took about a little less than a half an hour. I left a few things connected to the intake manifold and just moved it out of the way to make life easier. Once the intake manifold is out of our way, you can see our rear engine cover. There's still a few wires and things that have to be taken off before it can come off. I removed the intake manifold gasket and I put blue painter's tape over top of the holes that lead to the engine. I do this so that no dirt or bolts or nuts fall into the engine. Now we've got our valve cover. There's 19 bolts that hold it on. Once the valve cover comes off, you'll see the valve train. This one looks pretty clean because we do oil changes regularly. Sometimes there is sludge buildup. Now you're going to want to clean where the gasket sits because there's going to be some oil, maybe a little bit of dirt. So you're going to want to clean up where the gasket sits on the engine. After you do that, you can clean up the valve cover itself and the groove where the gasket sits. Now before you put the cover on, there's 2 spots where you're going to want to add some RTV silicone. You're going to do this because there's a point where 2 different engine pieces come together and there's a seam or a crack that oil can leak out of. So a little dab of silicone, right, and you're all set to put your valve cover back on. Now before I move along and put the intake manifold back on, I'm going to replace the spark plugs while I'm in here. Now the spark plugs have to have a specific gap. For this car it's 0.039 to 0.43 inches or 1 to 1.1 millimeters. I'm going to set ours to 0.041 inches. You can measure spark plugs with a spark plug gap tool. The spark plugs I bought were pre-gapped, so they already came at 0.041 inches. I went ahead and measured the old spark plugs as they came out, and they were still in specifications, but it was a good idea to change them anyway. While looking at them, I saw a little bit of carbon buildup. Once the spark plugs are in, you can put everything back together on the back side of the engine, right, and move to the front. The front cover is going to be the same as the rear. You're going to have some brackets and wires that are going to have to be moved out of your way to get to the 19 bolts that hold the cover on. Once these bolts come out, you can pull the cover off, right, clean everything up, put your new gasket in, apply your RTV, put the cover back on, and then put everything back together. And don't forget your spark plugs. All in all, this took about 2.5 hours. The book time was 3.3, and you would add some time for the spark plugs as well. So if you were at work, you would have made some extra money, or if you were at home, you would have saved yourself some money. But anyway, this is Mr. V, and I'm out.